going to happen. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome tonight our guest presenter. This is the fourth week in Beginning Farmer 150, Woodland Enterprises for Farm Management. And one of the very popular enterprises that many farmers in the northeastern U.S., and that's kind of like the 20 northeastern states, one of the popular enterprise and one that has a tremendous amount of heritage is that of maple syrup production. And so tonight, the first speaker is going to be Steve Childs. Steve is the New York State Maple Specialist at Cornell University Cooperative Extension and also director of the New York State, of the Cornell Maple Program, and director of the Arnott Teaching and Research Forest maple production process. So Steve has statewide experience. He travels throughout the Northeast and Canada. He has personal experience from years gone by and recent experience where he's producing maple syrup to make a budget and also do research and extension at the same time. So this is a really great opportunity. I'm going to turn off my video so I don't challenge the bandwidth. And with this, Steve, if you want to share your screen, and I'll turn it over to you. And thank you, Steve, for taking the time to join us.
All right, Pete. Listening to you talk about all the stuff I'm supposed to do makes me tired here. Tonight our topic is evaluating a potential sugar bush. And am I coming across with the program presentation as should be, Pete?
Yeah, we see the thumbnails. So if you want to click on the view mode.
I may have to knock myself out of view mode on my other screen. Okay, now.
There you go.
We're there, right?
You're there. Yep. All right. I'm going to mute again.
Evaluating a potential forest for a sugar bush. And of course, one of the main things that we would need to consider is, do you have maple trees? I've been asked many times to go out and help evaluate a forest for whether it would be a good maple woods or not, only to come away saying there really aren't enough maple trees here. Or we've also come away sometimes and said, yes, there's lots of maple. And key to that, of course, is to be able to identify what trees are maple. And we are just entering the time of year where that becomes much more difficult. When the leaves are on the tree, it's not very hard to discern which trees are maples and what kind of maples they are. When you have all of the buds and all of the limbs way up out of sight, and you have nothing but the bark of the tree to look at, that complicates it a lot for people who are not actually very experienced. It takes a significant experience to be able to bark ID trees. Actually, you can make maple syrup with a number of different maple trees. The two that have been historically predominantly used are the sugar maple and the black maple. And actually, there's no reason to try to have to differentiate between those two. They're very productive. And then red maple actually is one that's been used in the past, but its use is becoming much more predominant. It's people are adding red maples significantly. Then you can tap silvers. You can actually tap Norways. You can tap box elder trees. And of course, some of these have things that are not quite as positive as others. As you can see, there's a picture of sugar maple bark. And I would say trees vary significantly from region to region in the state. And even within the same woods, there may be a couple of different types in a woods, so that they don't actually all look exactly alike. Some that grow faster will not look the same as trees that are growing slower. But there is the typical maple bark, as you see. If you can access the buds of a tree, they are also very helpful and make it much easier to identify. The buds are opposite, and on black maple and sugar maple, the buds are very sharp enough so that if you were to push against them with your finger, you would wonder if it was going to puncture. Black maple has the black buds, and sugar maple tends to be a variety of tans, slightly reddish on occasion. But you can see kind of there's a picture that indicates that. And the maple leaf, this is a sugar maple leaf. All sugar maple leaves tend to be 5-lobed, and the 2 bottom lobes, of course, aren't very large there, but when you see a 3-lobed leaf, it definitely looks different. And it has what we would call smooth edges, even though there are a number of curves and points. When you see a red maple leaf, you'll see how significantly different those are. This is a black maple. There again, the bark varies quite a bit in black maple. And you can see in the picture, there's a picture of a 3-lobed leaf. Now in black maple, not all the leaves are 3-lobed. Some of the leaves are 5, some are 3. And so that can be a little bit confusing, but the black buds really are the identifier if you need to make that identification. The red maple, the buds are very different. The buds are red, the buds are round, and they get quite large as the weather starts to warm up in the spring, as opposed to sugar maple and black maple, which the buds will stay very small, very tight for most of the maple season until you're at the very end before you start to see them swell. Red maple, you might see them swelling if you get some warm weather, even in January, starting to put some size on. If you're looking at younger trees, the red maple has this characteristic of the roughness starting in like target areas. So you can see in the picture there that there are like 3 areas that are rough and the rest of the bark is very smooth, whereas sugar maple, it starts very gradually kind of all over. And as you get into bigger red maple, the bark tends to be rougher than it is in sugar maple. And yet again, like I say, they do vary significantly from place to place and even within the same property. And again, depending on sometimes on how fast they're growing. Here you see a red maple leaf, and it has the 5 lobes, and it has the same basic shape. And yeah, if you look at the edges of the leaf, it looks just like a handsaw with many teeth. And if you put the 2 side by side, it's very easy to see. This is a silver maple. You can see they have the round buds. The buds are not red. They tend to be gray. And they also can become quite large early in the winter as you get a little bit of warm spell. Bark on silver maple, depending on where it came from, because a lot of these came in New York anyway, came from nurseries. And the barks can be very, very smooth, and they can be very, very rough, rougher than any other maple that I'm aware of. And so the bark can be really a difficult one. On the other hand, leaves are by far the easiest. They have the very deep cuts and very easy to identify. If you were to go out in the woods now, even though in many cases a lot of the leaves are off, finding leaves on the ground can be helpful, but it's not always a sure thing because leaves do move around from place to place by the wind. So then we have these trees that have not traditionally been tapped very much. The red maple, like I say, is now becoming much more in use. Silver maples, some places in the Midwest are actually tapping a significant number of silvers. Norways are mostly a village tree. We don't see them in the woods very often unless you're very close to a village. And then box elders are everywhere. These tend to have earlier bud swelling, which I think in the old days was considered to be a huge problem. But we're kind of discovering now that we don't necessarily get off flavor as soon as we see bud swelling in these trees. It's still, we get a condition in syrup that we call buddy. And what happens is the tree adds an amino acid to the sap that doesn't taste all that good. So the syrup, instead of tasting like maple, begins to taste like a Tootsie Roll or slightly chocolatey, and then it becomes much more rank as you get into the warmer part of the season. So people have been nervous that these bud swellings were might be throwing the flavor off. That is not what we've been finding. It seems that the bud swelling isn't necessarily the whole issue. It may be day length, it may be growing degree days, and even though bud swelling is related to some of that, it's not directly related to flavor completely. The other issue with these other trees, the reds, the silvers, the Norways, the box elders, they tend to be lower sugar content for a tree that has the same sort of crown characteristics. On the other hand, a lot of these trees grown in village areas or on the edges actually can have significant sugar. I've seen Norway maples with just under 3% sugar in a yard where they just have a huge crown. I've seen box elders that were as high as 4%, and there was the same situation. A sugar maple in that same situation would be slightly higher. With the coming of reverse osmosis into the maple world, we don't really seem to care near as much how sweet the sap is because it's just so much easier and less costly to strip that water out of the sap with reverse osmosis. So it's much more manageable now to use sap that's of a lower sugar content. So that's the trees that you can tap and some of the reasons why people might avoid or take on trees. Anytime you have a choice between a tree that has a good full bushy crown, you're going to get sweeter sap, and that's pretty valuable. Do you have trees of enough size to tap? If you looked at the video of evaluating a woods where we went out and did a forest for a person who was hopeful that they had a sugar bush, we went and evaluated that site, and the thing we came away with is they needed about 15 or 20 more years before they would have enough trees of tappable size. So take a look at that video. It walks through with visually what I'm talking about here tonight for the most part. And there is a table. It's an old one, and yet it seems to have a lot of merit as we've kind of evaluated it. And it says you don't start to tap a tree until it's 10 inches. When you get to 18 inches or more, then you put a second tap in. And when you get to 25 inches or more, you would put in a tap. And you can put in a tap for about every 40 to 48 inches of circumference once you get into those larger trees. So the issue with number of taps, a lot of people have a misconception that that's an issue of the health of the tree. And there's been research done in the past that shows that it didn't matter how many taps you put in a tree, the tree would simply heal up and go on with life. You can't take more sap out of the tree than what it refills itself with after a freeze. And over-tapping is an issue of productivity and quality, because when you tap a tree, you get a partition zone above and below the old tap hole. And if you tap into a partition zone, you get inferior quality sap and you get much less of it. So you want to keep as much clean white wood in the tree as possible so that you can tap it for many years and get top quality sap. So it's not an issue of tree health, it's an issue of quality and the expense of how many taps you put in the tree. You don't gain that much more by adding a whole bunch of taps. Are there enough trees close enough to each other to make a commercial sugar bush? For a backyarder, that's not an issue. You just have to find some trees enough to make as much syrup as you want. If you're looking at putting together a system whereby you can efficiently make syrup that you can make a profit on, then finding enough trees close enough to each other to make a commercial sugar bush then becomes an issue. And so we would call this tap density. The more concentrated the taps in a woods, the lower the cost per tap to install, for instance, a tubing system. The negative of too many taps could be a lack of other species in the woods, making it more vulnerable to insect and disease attack. In other words, you aren't looking for a woods that is 100% maple. Of course, if you have one, there's no reason not to tap it, but we don't want you to think that you need to thin a woods so that it is 100% maple, where that's happened many times when a forest tent caterpillar or gypsy moth or some of the other insect and disease issues come up. Those seem to be hardest hit where there's not a mixture of species. And the number that's come out of some research in Vermont would say you're safest to have 25% or a little more of species variety in a sugar bush to have that effect of providing less of an attack site. Also, overcrowding in a sugar bush can lead to lower sugar content in the trees and poor growth. So what do we mean by a tap density that can be commercial? If we're talking per acre, 1 to 20 taps per acre can be difficult to operate commercially. There's just a lot of expense in getting all the tubing out there, or how much you have to travel even to gather buckets. If you have 21 to 40 taps, you're kind of at a low efficiency, but it's workable, it's doable. When we get into that 40 to 80 taps per acre, that we call that a medium efficiency, and that works great. A lot of people are in that category. We can get into an ideal situation where we have 80 to 120 taps. We would consider that a maximum efficiency. And if you get over that 120 taps, chances are your woods is overcrowded. You're going to get a reduced sugar content, and you will get slow growth. And reduced sugar content, of course, just means that you have to do a lot more boiling, or you have to have an RO to make up for that difference. Slow growth is an issue in that keeping clean white wood becomes more difficult because you're tapping, but the tree is not growing fast enough to cover those old taps and partition zones up as fast as you might need to come back to that space on the tree. How do you decide how many taps you have per acre? There's kind of a unique way of using the basal area meter, which is just that plastic square that you see, and you stay in one spot and you spin a circle, and you have a second person at every tree that fills that square with the basal area of 10. You record into a chart, and from there you can evaluate a section of the woods for how many taps you would have per acre. And normally woods are not perfectly uniform, so you would need to go through the woods and do this a number of times. But it's very fast and it's very easy. It's much easier than measuring out plots and then counting trees using the basal area reader. And this is just an example of the chart. Trees are broken down into different size categories. They are taken times a multiplier that will convert that to how many trees there would be, or how many taps there would be per acre. And you can see once you get over 18 inches, then they're adding that second tap to each tree. So this chart, a chart like this, is available at the cornellmaple.com website under resources, under downloadable publications, and the publication there would be the New York State Maple Tubing and Vacuum Notebook. That's where you would find this, and full instructions on how to do that. So let's talk about sweetness of sap here for just a minute, as that's kind of an issue for maple producers. Sweetness of sap changes from year to year. It changes during the year based on how cold it gets. Once we get a cold spike, the sugar content will go up and then gradually walk its way back down again. And as you can imagine, by the time you get to the end of the maple season, you're not getting those cold spikes anymore, and the sugar content of sap gradually drops off as you get into warmer weather. This picture that we have on the left is a sap hydrometer. You need a significant amount of sap to do this measurement. So it's like a pint or a pint and a half, something like that. And so if you were going to wait for one spout to give you that amount of sap, that would take some real time. You can see we're about 3.6 on this sap. That would be excellent. And it's typical to see 1 to 5%. Like I say, years are different. This last year, our sugar content at the Arnott was pretty much consistently 1.1 until we had a really good cold spell in March. It then went up to about 1.8 or 1.9, and that was a season-long low sugar year, and a lot of the state experienced that. And we're thinking maybe that was due to the heavy seed set that we saw the fall before, but it was one of the hardest seed sets, biggest seed sets most of us have seen in our lifetime. So we think that's what it might be. We can't necessarily prove that. It's just an observation. The other way of looking at the sugar content of sap is to use a sap refractometer. In this, you only need a couple of drops, so you can check individual trees and see what they're doing. You simply put the drops on the face of the lens, you look through the lens, and in there you can see where a shadow crosses a scale. And in this case, you can see that shadow crosses a scale at 4.5. That's excellent sugar content. So how much difference does it make if you're just boiling sap without use of a reverse osmosis? And you have the choice of a nice big crown top in your backyard, or a tree with a small canopy stuck in a crowded woods. If you have 1% sap, you need to boil away about 86 gallons of water to get your 1 gallon of syrup. And if you can get 2% sap, you only need to boil away 43 gallons of sap to get your 1 gallon of syrup. If you can get up into that 3 and 4% range, you can get that down to 32 or even as low as 21. So you can see, even in a commercial setting, having trees that are overcrowded and low sugar creates more work and less product. So does the location of your trees give you the needed access? The issue with maple sap is that it's heavy and it's bulky, and you need to get it to where you're going to process it. So the location of those trees can become a critical issue. So what we would consider a good site of a sugar bush as far as access goes, a good sugar house or open road, normally kept open all winter, because when you start tapping, a lot of times there's still significant snow, downhill and within 1,000 feet of that forest. That means usually we can get maple tubing to go that 1,000 feet without severe friction loss in our tubing. And if it's downhill, that can happen without much human effort at all, actually, once the tubing system is in place. So if you have a woods that's uphill from where you place your sugar bush, or where you place your collection tank, where you would come pick that tank up, then that's a great situation. A medium situation is where a sugar house or an open road that's normally open all winter is downhill and within 2,000 feet, or a seasonal road that you could maintain as a maple producer is downhill and within 2,000 feet of a collection site. Open road, sugar house, or seasonal road is level with the production woods is not bad. Once you get out past several thousand feet, friction loss in tubing can become a significant issue, and you need to put in bigger tubing in order to get things to happen the way you want, and so you're adding to the expense of your system. Poor is there's no obvious access road. It must be constructed by the producer and kept open by the producer. Production woods is downhill from an open road or downhill from the sugar house or the seasonal road, or greater than 3,000 feet downhill to the sugar house. So pulling sap uphill is difficult. It can be done if there's electricity there and you can put pumps in. Vacuum has a limit of pulling uphill about 35 feet unless you inject air into it. And when you inject air into it, there's a cost of how much vacuum capacity that's gonna take. So the expense just goes up. In many cases, there is no remediation. You can install new roads. You can move your sugar house. You can utilize a pump house, or lease a site for a collection tank if you don't happen to own it, so that you can make it work. Now, that's access for getting the volume and weight of sap out of there. There's another issue for access for maintenance of your system. So we just made some major changes here at the Arnott, where for many years we were blocked out of about 30 acres by main lines running up the roadsides. And everything we did in there, we had to carry everything in by hand, carry everything out by hand. The sap, of course, was going out through the tubing. But we had very limited access. So when we're replacing that tubing after a thinning, we have made sure that we put that together so that we have four-wheeler or snowmobile access deep into that woods and without interfering with our tubing system. And If you need information on how to approach those kind of things, there again, you go to this vacuum and tubing notebook that is on the Cornell Maple website. So for access for maintenance, access roads throughout for maintaining tubing is good, thinning and woods to the woods, and within the woods. So you need that access within the woods and to the woods. Medium would be access roads just to the woods, and poor would be you don't even have access to the site with a motorized vehicle of any kind, and you have to carry everything all the way into those places. So the remediation is like, in our case, we tore the old tubing system wall out and replaced it in such a way that we have excellent access for maintaining it. Another important issue for a maple operation, not necessarily just the woods, but the sugar bush, but you need access to electricity. If we're going to be operating a vacuum system, that takes electricity unless there's the use of the new 3/16 tubing, which can create its own vacuum. And with that, we are finding it has some issues of its own, but it is a lot.
Steve, we can't hear you. I can't.
Yeah, he's not coming through.
Okay, good. Steve? Steve? All right, so it's not just me. Let's see. All right. He's muted himself. Steve?
Yes.
All right, there we can hear you.
Did I go away?
You did. We lost sound at 500 feet of electricity from 500 feet distance to electricity.
Okay. That might be our system here, but it seems whatever it did, it's back.
You're going to have to reshare your screen.
Let's see. I guess I have to reconnect to Zoom. Okay, there we go.
You're connected.
Share.
Go to share.
Tubing notebook.
All right, there we can see thumbnails. The last we heard was your discussion of medium level access. All right, are you talking?
I'm ready to, if you can hear.
Yep, go right ahead.
Here we go.
All right, back at it.
So a medium sort of situation, if you can get electric within 500 feet, then you can run tubing from that site out to make things work. And like I was just starting to say, a generator gives you electricity, but you have to get fuel and you have to be there to turn things on and turns off in many cases. So a generator is a troublesome alternative. Poor access to the collection site is just very limited. There's no alternative other than a generator. You can use buckets, you can install road for easier access, you can install electric. Many of those are very expensive choices. Why is it so important about power? There are two technologies that make maple production much more profitable, and I don't know how to overemphasize that word much. And one of those is vacuum. That requires electricity at the sugar bush, and the other is reverse osmosis, which typically would require electricity at the sugar house. And those are the two things that have made maple much more profitable, and growth in the maple industry has really gone tremendously fast in the last 15 years, with almost a 4 times growth. And a lot of that I have to lay to vacuum and reverse osmosis, and then a number of other technologies that have come in. We also need electricity in many cases because we're going to do canning, or we want to make value-added products, and marketing can be a whole lot handier to do if there is electricity. And one of the issues that needs to be taken into consideration is the steepness of the site for tubing, is what this is talking about in this case. And good is a gradual downhill to the collection site with B-type slopes, 3 to 8%. They're not over difficult for you to work in. You can take equipment in at those slopes, and the sap will run in a direction of the slope very handily. Medium would be steep enough to be difficult in some places, or too flat. So usually slopes of 0 to 3% would be considered somewhat difficult, especially as you get closer to that 0, because we want our sap to run downhill to our collection site, and it takes a lot of special effort to get that to happen if you are close to flat. And then you get into the severe slopes, 8 to 15%. These are almost impossible to work without a lot of road development to get four-wheelers and snowmobiles to work well in there. And depending on your physical condition, the 8 to 15% can be quite a physical challenge. Poor would be access to difficult slopes greater than 15%. It's just very difficult to work at those angles. For buckets, a good slope is actually the 0 to 3% slope, and the B slopes 3 to 8% can work. Once you get steeper than a B slope, working those areas and trying to gather buckets and get it back to a collection rig and have that rig be able to climb those hills becomes much more difficult. In fact, if you look at the history of where maple is produced in New York State, its greatest history is in the rolling hills areas. And the steeper slopes, even though they had many maples on them, and they're now being tapped with tubing, were not the traditional areas. Are your trees healthy enough for producing quality syrup? And so what are we looking at here? Health and quality of available trees. Healthy trees, one of the ways we know we have good healthy trees is we rapidly close our tap holes, and our canopy is not too closed. It's not so tight that we're getting poor growth. Medium would be tree health is mixed, canopy can be closed, and there's some indicators of poor health, such as very slow tap hole closure, very poor crowns development in the crowns, so there's not a lot of leaves out there creating sugar. And if we're poor, we're actually getting some crown dieback. We see thin crowns. We have numerous trees with health issues, such as the different cankers. See attack by the maple borer. Those are signs that things are not all that good out there, and production will be a piece of that. Poor can happen where you have excessively drained soils, or where you have overly heavy soils, and the trees in those sites will experience the extremes of wet and dry. So remediation is thin to reduce the abundance of medium to poor quality trees, favor maples on better soils. I know that some in the past have put in diversion ditches and helped control water flow and some of those kind of things. Those can be very expensive and difficult to do in a wood setting. Indicators of unhealthy trees, as we mentioned, stem defects. If someone did a bad job of harvesting, doing a lot of bark removal in a woods, that can be a sign of serious stem defects. We have insect scars, fungal conchs, and so on the trees. We can see a lot of weak forks maybe in those trees. Crown defects would be where you see dieback and thin crowns, and a live crown ratio less than 30%, where you see recent defoliations can be an issue. And then, of course, exposed roots due to erosion, skidder damage, just tractor damage, four-wheeler damage, those kind of things can be indicators of unhealthy trees. Our management practice is necessary before you begin to tap. You have this woods, or you are looking at a woods, considering whether you want to go in there or not. Are there things you should do before you do that? And does that in some ways make it impractical for you to decide that you should tap that area? So for instance, some needed management. If you have no canopy thinning or understory vegetation that needs to be managed, that can take a significant amount of work. For instance, you have beech thickets that are very difficult to work with, blackberry thickets. Those kind of things can be a problem, whereas here we're saying we don't have those issues, where we would say it's a good situation. A medium situation where is light to medium thinning in the canopy or trees, or understory vegetation management is needed. So it's just light work that needs to be done in there. If it's poor, that means there's a lot of trees that need to come down, a lot of species in there that are not adding to it, and they're taking away from our maples, even though we do want some percentage in there. A lot of times there's trees that are just doing damage to the maple trees as far as shading and so on. So the remediation where we do need it is to thin the woods by some crop tree release management, and Pete will, I'm sure, describe that at some point in this course, or basal area reduction, or managing undesirable vegetation. And some of these things can make for a lot of work. If you do a significant thinning, having the tops dealt with can be a real significant problem as far as getting around with tubing. Is the mix of species in the sugar bush a potential problem? And here, this is talking about specific trees that actually cause issues with our system. And one of those is evergreen trees. And so good would be where you have little or no interfering understory species or evergreen trees. Evergreen trees can shade a tubing system and leave it froze for many hours into the day when the sap is running on the uphill side of that. And so that is that can be a serious problem in a woods if the mixture is maple and evergreens of some sort. Medium is some evergreen trees, some interfering understory, and if we get too many of our trees in there being sugar maple, we can have that problem of pests being more of a problem. Significant evergreen trees present, less than 10% basal area other than sugar maple. Significant interfering understory, things like multiflora rose, honeysuckle, other thorn trees, briars, blackberries, beech, poison ivy. All of these can make varying degrees of difficulty dealing with making a forest into a nice sugar bush. You can thin the woods to enhance the species composition and control those interfering species. Sometimes that happens without huge effort. Other times it is very difficult to change things. Will the soils in the sugar bush cause problems? And this is, it can be very helpful to go to your soil and water and find out just what that woods is, especially if you're at the position where you're thinking about buying the woods. Poorly drained, or we might as well start with the good. We're looking for well-drained and moderately well-drained soils. And there is the website there where you can go to USDA page to find a soil map in New York State. Medium would be excessively well-drained soils and somewhat poorly drained soils. And then poor, of course, is the very swampy areas. Now, swampy areas don't seem to bother the red maples anywhere near as much as the sugars and blacks, but a very swampy area. Its problem is the roots in that area can be very shallow. And so when it's really wet, the trees suffer, of course, when you get a real wet spell. But they also suffer when you get a extended dry spell, because the roots are so shallow and they can use up all the water in that top 6 or 8 inches that they are only rooted into. and then suffer severe drought damage, and that's where you get crown dieback in many cases. And it doesn't happen right away. The crown dieback due to drought, a lot of times you don't see that until 3 and 4 years later, when you start to see the bark falling off the trees in those upper branches, and you're saying, wow, I'm getting dieback. What's causing it? And you have to think backwards to severe weather that has happened in your fairly recent past. Do I know enough about the technology of producing maple? If I want to get into a maple operation, what do I need to know? Should I start small or just play with this for a year or two to learn what it's all about? Do I need to get some books? Do I need to go to some meetings? Do I need to talk to some experience? Those are the kind of things that a person needs to evaluate before diving in and making a significant investment in a sugar bush operation. There are many people who have kind of plunged in and then found that they'd made some expensive mistakes. And I've known a number of people who do a significant research, years of research, knowing that they're going to retire at a certain age or a certain time, and they wanted to put in a maple operation at that time. And so they spent several years working in like the New York State Fair to see what sells and what products sell and just how sales happen, or spending some time working for another maple producer for a time just to see how that goes. So that's a huge question, actually. What do you know? For instance, the difference that it makes to have vacuum. Many people would say, I don't like vacuum. I think it might hurt the trees. There's actually no evidence of that at this point. But the difference here, you can see where I just had gravity in this case here at the Arnott Forest, 10 gallons of sap per year, where I had gravity system, and 26 gallons of sap per tap per year, where we had just 16 inches of vacuum. That is a difference of 151%, or 2.5 times more sap. That's more than a quart of sap produced from every spout, more than where you did not put the vacuum in. Many people were kind of enjoyed the old-fashioned way of using buckets, and there's nothing wrong with that, but the productivity in buckets is less and the labor is significantly more. There's also the use of the bags. They work fine. They're, again, lower productivity and physical labor goes dramatically up. This is just a picture of a tubing system and how it's put together. You put the tubes around your end tree, and then you wrap it zigzagging to some degree so that your tubes are held up by the tension of the tube against the bark of a number of trees. And then it would go into a main line or into a collection tank. So tubing is a major thing in maple now. I would say that probably 95% of the syrup that is made in New York State is made using tubing, even though there might be more than 5% who actually do use buckets, but the volume of syrup comes through tubing. Tubing has its issues. This is squirrel damage. There's our friend. He loves to work on it. Coyotes, wolver, fishers, all kinds of animals seem to like to take a bite occasionally. Coyotes. Deer actually are kind of blamed for a lot of things, but deer is actually one of the least problems that we worry about. They seem to walk through a woods much like a human would, stepping over and ducking under the tubing. Every once in a while you get one that thinks it's their bubble gum, but not that often. Natural vacuum is what we call 3/16 tubing, because it's small enough that the air cannot pass the liquid in that tubing. The weight of the sap in the tubing generates a vacuum. This is one of our experimental plots at the Arnott, showing that we were getting just shy of 27 inches of vacuum just from the weight of sap in that tubing. Because the tubing is small, it can have some issues with blocking, but if you have steep areas, it can do great things for you. Do I have a way of evaluating costs? And we're getting almost to the end here, Pete. I don't know where my time is at the moment. But do I have a way of evaluating costs? We actually put together a spreadsheet that is available online. And in there, you need two pieces of information. You need to know the number of trees per acre, which you can figure out with the basal area square. And then how many trees you'd like to average on your lateral lines. And then, of course, the prices of the different pieces of equipment need to be put in based on who you're buying from. And that will, you put those pieces of information in, and it'll tell you how much you will have to pay out per acre to put in a tubing system. This is just materials within the acre, and it does not include labor. This is simply to figure out your materials cost. And in this case, we were looking at a cost of $3.89 for every tap in the woods, with that 120 tap count, which is right there at the peak of ideal. And then we also put in 12 taps on the lateral, which the more you put on a lateral, the lower your cost will be, but your productivity tends to fall. Once you get past a couple of taps, the more you put on a line, the more it hinders the vacuum at the tree and the less yield you will end up with. So this is just a couple of examples. Estimated cost per acre, where we had 20 trees per acre, and we wanted to put 6 taps on a lateral line. You can see our cost per tap. Cost per acre isn't that high, but we don't have that many trees. Our cost per tap is actually up there at $10.91 per tap. That's pretty high. And we can come in and say, if we had 60 trees per acre and we put 6 taps on, we can drop that cost down to $6.45 per tap, or $386 per acre. Or we can say trees per acre at 110, and we're putting 6 per tap. We get that cost down to about $5. Material cost for tubing within the acre to $5.03. And I emphasize that in the acre because one of the things that a spreadsheet like this can't account for is how far you are from your sugar house or from your collection tank. If the woods goes right to the tank, these numbers are as far as you have to go. If you have to go across the field or go through a section of woods where there is no maples, or your sugar house is just plain a couple thousand feet away, the cost of the line to get to the acre is a separate calculation. And here's just another. We're going to go to 10 taps per lateral. We're down to $4.23. 20 taps per lateral line, we're down to $3.62. And if I could put 30 on there, which you can do with the 3/16, where our cost is down there near that $3.42 in the same woods, depending on how many taps we want on a lateral. So that spreadsheet, as I mentioned, is available at thecornellmaple.com. It does need to be updated for the price of what it is you're buying, whether it's spouts or wire or mainline. All those things would need to be added in. And so I don't know how you handle questions at this time, Pete, but I guess I'll turn it back over to you to do that.
All right. Thank you, Steve. So I've got some questions. We already have one question that's typed in. So if anybody has questions, this is when you can be thinking about those questions. If you want to turn on your microphone, feel free to do that. Historically, you haven't done that. And there's no reason not to. It's, in my mind, it's easier than typing, but you can type your question or verbalize your question. So Emily asked if you could say again how many acres you need for efficient production.
The efficient production is more based on how many trees you have per acre. If you want to talk about efficiency as far as owning equipment and making it into an operation that actually makes you some money, a lot of that actually comes down to your personality, in that whether you are a good person for controlling cost or whether you like to buy all the latest and the greatest and have other people do a lot of the work for you as far as installing tubing or building a sugar house or all those kind of things. So that is a very, very broad question. I do know that of a number of maple producers who are making syrup with about a 500 tap operation, who have figured out through their marketing of various value-added products and keeping their prices good and so on, who are very happy with their income from that. I couldn't tell you what it necessarily is per tap. We did those evaluations a few years ago and found that it varies a lot between producers and, like I say, how well they like to control cost. We here at the RNOT, we have a market through the Cornell University. When I took over here, there were only about 2,500 taps here, and we weren't able to meet all of Cornell's demand for syrup. So we've upsized so that we can meet all of that demand as best we can, and we, of course, want to add new products such as some maple soft drink and maple sugar and maple foil packs for sports consumption and things like that. So we feel we're going to have to end up somewhere around 8,000 taps just to meet the market that's right in our pocket.
So if you were going to, and I'm gonna try and push you out as far onto the limb as you're willing to go. If you had and so what Steve is describing is that if you have diversified markets and a variety of different products that stem from maple, then you can be profitable as a business with fewer taps. So Steve, the question for you is, if all somebody wanted to do was just let's say sell syrup onto the bulk market, right? So they put it into a barrel and they sell it to a packaging house. Just round numbers. I'm just like, and this is, we're not going to hold you to these numbers, but just round numbers. If somebody was just producing bulk syrup, how many taps would they need to be profitable?
There again, your cost control comes into that completely, but you,
Robin, are we talking
I don't see
2,000, 5,000, 10,000? Give it to the nearest 5,000. What are we looking at?
I can't imagine it being very profitable at anything less than a couple thousand taps.
Okay, that's better than I thought. I would have guessed 10,000 to be profitable if all you're doing is bulk production.
That doesn't mean it's a big profit.
Okay, okay. All right, so let's say you're at the other end.
If you want to make the most money, sell all of your syrup as maple cotton candy.
All right, so that's at the other end of the spectrum.
That's the other end of the spectrum.
We have somebody that is really a penny pincher. You know, it's like Ebenezer Scrooge wishes he could be. They're, you know, they control all their costs.
Here's your biggest issue, Pete, and that is, how much do you want to be paid per hour? And that's where I say you need to be up in that several thousand tap range if you're going to do it bulk, simply because of how much labor you're going to have to put into it. And if you want to be paid any kind of reasonable rate for that labor, if you don't count your labor, which is what a number of people do, they say, what else am I going to do? Watch television? I might as well make maple syrup. So they make $3 an hour on their maple syrup, but they work enough hours so that it turns into some real money.
Okay. So another question is, let's say we have a participant here tonight and or in the class, and they realize they have, you know, let's say 1,000 taps, but they have you know, there's for some reason they're really compelled towards maple. Is there any way they can get more sap to effectively increase their tap count? I mean, like they could. Are you still there, Steve? Did we lose Steve? Hello, Steve. Can anyone hear Steve?
Nope.
All right. Thank you, Ron. Steve, we lost you. So, what do I do here? Are you there, Steve? Oh, he disconnected. So the question for Steve, hopefully he'll come back. he didn't turn into a pumpkin. I don't think that was the case. The question was, and I was baiting Steve. He knows the answer to this. The question deals with either buying sap or leasing trees. So you as a farmer may have interest in maple production, and there's considerable profitability. I mean, there are families that all they do is maple, and that's their only source of income, and they're comfortable. So if you're in a situation where you have maybe not enough land, so it assumes you're in an area where you have the potential for good maple production, your two options are that you can lease taps or that you can buy sap. And when you lease taps, you'll pay so much per tap or so much per tree, and then you go in. You'd have a lease arrangement that would extend over probably at least 5 years. If you're putting in tubing, you want to be able to recover that upfront investment. Steve showed you some of those numbers, and I'm surprised some of those higher numbers would only be appropriate for a 3/16 tubing. If you're using 5/16 or the traditional tubing, then you're going to be somewhere down around 5 to 7 taps per tree. So Antigon's having audio. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. I felt like I had some very profound thoughts, and I was afraid nobody heard those. So one option is to lease taps. The other one is to buy syrup, or I'm sorry, to buy sap. You could also buy syrup, but to buy sap, you would work with other people in your community who would deliver sap to you. You would pay them. You would calculate the sugar concentration of the sap, and you would pay them as a function of the quality of the sap that they would deliver. And the value of doing this is that you don't carry any of the cost of installing the tubing, maintaining the tubing, collecting the sap, any of that. What you do is you have the equipment for processing, and you have your processing equipment operational for a greater percentage of time. You can spend, on a hobby farm, you may spend $2,000, let's say, on a hobby backyard evaporator. That's like to produce enough syrup for you and your uncle and your cousin and your neighbor. An entry grade commercial evaporator might cost you $10,000 or $15,000. The evaporator at the Arnott Forest, we have right now we have 6,000 taps. We have a double reverse osmosis system, so we can process larger quantity of saps. That evaporator is in the $20,000 to $25,000 range. So you can make some very significant investments in processing equipment. You're paying for, if you have payments on that, you're paying for that every day or every month or every year until it's paid off. If you're not processing sap, you're losing money, so to speak. So without, so if you were to buy sap, you're able to use that processing equipment more efficiently, and it's actually a very profitable venture if you have local people who are willing to sell you sap. So that's the big if question mark. Historically, it's on a 50-50 basis. So you say, all right, and it's 50% of the wholesale value of syrup. So if the wholesale value of syrup is let's say $44 a gallon, they bring in sap, you calculate the syrup equivalent of the sap that's brought in, and the sap producer makes $22 per gallon of syrup. You make $22 a gallon per syrup. When you do that, the sap producer loses money. You make a lot of money. So if you can work that out as a sap buyer, that's to your advantage, but it's not sustainable for the producer. You can make a significant amount of money as a syrup producer if you pay about 62% of the value of syrup, and you retain then 38% of the value of the syrup. So that's a kind of a delicate balance there. You don't make as much money, but you keep sap producers happy. And when you keep sap producers happy, then you have a good flow of sap. So let me just see. Looks like Steve. I don't know if we have Steve is coming back or not. I don't see him. He maybe got bumped off. So let's see if there's any other questions. So Jake asked about the organic market. There is an organic market that's significant enough that some maple producers are getting into it. There's not a lot of people in it. So all I can say is that it's not lucrative enough that everybody's flocking to it. My guess is that the image of maple syrup is that it's an organic product. And so probably most people assume that what they're buying is an organic product. And I mean, you can, without too much trouble, you can make organic maple syrup. Whether or not you can label it as organic is another question. So there's a question about the cost. What about the revenue and the profit? So if you're having, there's a spreadsheet that's on cornellmaple.com that looks at the valuation of a maple tree for timber versus its valuation for maple syrup production. An average tree, so at the Arnott Forest, we average about 1/3 of a gallon of syrup per tree, and we sell our syrup for $60 a gallon. So each tree is producing gross $20 of syrup per tree per year, which is pretty good. And that's well above our cost margin. I don't know what our actual kind of differential is. So 5 acres of trees, if you had 100 trees on those acres, this is Emily's question. If you had 100 trees per acre and things worked well, you'd have 500 taps. You could probably be profitable if you were really good at containing your costs and really good at marketing your product. You could also do that with a budget sheet that would put you into the negative if you did not control costs and you were not good at marketing your products. Mary Michael asks about ag and markets regulations. Excuse me. I think I should defer that. So it depends a little bit. If you have an on-farm operation, you have greater flexibility than if you were to set up a sugar house and you bought syrup or you bought sap. So if you're buying syrup, there are going to be significantly greater regulations on that. If you're producing all of the sap or if you're buying sap and then processing the sap, I think that the regulations are reasonably friendly, but I'm not fluent in that discourse. So we need to get that from Steve. Let me type in Steve's email address, slc18 at cornell.edu. So feel free to contact Steve with that question. All right, so I think I've answered the maple questions. Are there other maple questions that y'all have? All right, let's see if we had Steve come back. Doesn't appear so. All right, I'm going to stop recording.